They say the stones of Windsor remember that beneath the tapestries and velvet curtains, under the glittering chandeliers that once lit the grandest feasts of kings, there still lingers the echo of a scream that never quite fades. Tonight, on History 1, we invite you to step beyond the velvet rope to the forbidden side of Windsor Castle's past, where the royal bloodline met a curse, where a single night of indulgence became a century of whispered dread. If you love untold truths, dark corridors of history, and stories the crown tried to bury, subscribe now, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see royal history forever. This is Horror in the Halls, the deadly feast and the ghostly curse at Windsor Castle. It began, as most royal tragedies do, with a celebration. The year was 1483, a time of uncertainty and deceit. King Edward IV had just died, leaving behind a kingdom trembling between loyalty and ambition. Within the walls of Windsor, preparations were underway for what was meant to be a feast of loyalty, a gathering of nobles to swear allegiance to the young Prince Edward, soon to be Edward V. But among the torches and laughter, there were other preparations being made. You see, Windsor Castle wasn't merely a fortress. It was a crucible of power, and secrets had always seeped into its stones. Beneath the great hall, where the feast was to take place, there existed a network of forgotten chambers. Some said they were remnants of Roman foundations. Others whispered they were something older, pagan. The masons who once built them vanished, leaving behind carvings that resembled neither Christian symbols nor any known royal insignia. Yet, that night, one of those chambers was unlocked. It was Lady Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor, the woman history remembers as pious and calculating, who had sent her spies into Windsor. Her servant, disguised as a kitchen hand, carried with him not food, but a vial. Its contents shimmered faintly green in the torchlight. He poured it not into the goblet of the boy prince. No, that would have been too easy, too obvious, but into the wine cask itself, meant for the entire royal table. Except, something went wrong. The poison, later discovered in forbidden monastic texts, was not of mortal making. It was known as aqua tenebris, the water of darkness. Created by monks who had turned from faith to forbidden alchemy, it was said to blur the boundary between the living and the dead. Those who drank it would not simply perish. They would linger. And linger they did. When the bells of Windsor struck midnight, the laughter of the feast turned into coughing. Servants screamed as nobles clutched their throats, wine frothing crimson at their lips. The young Prince Edward collapsed, his crown of silver falling from his head and rolling across the floor with a hollow clang that echoed far longer than it should have. But what chilled those who survived wasn't the death. It was what came after. Because as dawn broke over the Thames, the guards swore they saw figures still seated at the banquet table, pale, unmoving, their eyes open, their mouths faintly twitching as though whispering a prayer. The Feast of Windsor became a massacre shrouded in silence. The official record was rewritten. Servants vanished, walls were rebuilt, and the event was erased from royal chronicles. Only one witness, the castle's confessor, Father Alaric, dared to record what he had seen in a secret journal that would not resurface until 1871. His words, translated from Latin, read, "The feast was damned. The souls of the lords wander still in the hall of shadows. Their eyes seek the boy king who never took the throne. Windsor stones remember what man wishes to forget. And so began the curse of Windsor. Over the centuries, servants whispered of footsteps in empty corridors, of cold breath near their necks when no one stood behind them. Royal guests refused to dine in the great hall after sunset, and in every portrait painted of that room since 1500, there is always, faintly in the background, a shadow where no person stood. Even Queen Victoria, known for her rational mind, refused to sleep in the East Wing after an encounter one December night, when she claimed she heard a boy's laughter echoing from the Great Hall. But what few realize is that the curse did not end there, because Windsor Castle still holds one final secret, one that connects the deadly feast of 1483 to the mysterious illness that struck the royal household 400 years later. And that secret lies beneath the floorboards of St. George's Chapel, where the dead whisper to those who dare to listen. When the restoration of St. George's Chapel began in 1871, the workmen uncovered something that was not supposed to exist. They had been ordered to repair the crypt beneath the choir stalls, but as the masons chipped through a decayed portion of the floor, their tools struck air, a hollow space. The foreman peered through the opening and found a narrow stone passage descending into darkness. It was unmarked, unrecorded in any royal blueprint. The next morning, under the supervision of Sir Henry Ponsonby, Queen Victoria's private secretary, they opened the passage. Torches revealed a small vaulted chamber, heavy with centuries of dust. The walls were covered in carvings, serpents entwined with crowns, Latin phrases twisted into strange forms. But at the far end of the chamber, resting upon a cracked marble slab, was something else entirely. A long dining table, perfectly preserved in the dry air. The men froze. 11 chairs surrounded it, all identical except for the 12th, larger, more ornate, gilded faintly even beneath the grime. And on that chair lay a tiny silver crown, tarnished and bent, its design unmistakable to any historian. It belonged to Prince Edward V, the lost boy king who vanished from the tower. Sir Henry, a man of reason, ordered the chamber sealed again. But one of the workmen, Thomas Bexley, disobeyed. That night, after the others had gone, curiosity lured him back. He took the crown, for history, he would later claim, and brought it home to Eton. Within a week, Thomas Bexley was dead. His wife told the inquest that he awoke each night screaming, convinced that someone was sitting at the foot of the bed asking for his crown. When they found his body, his hands were locked around his own throat, and his face bore the expression of terror, eyes wide, mouth frozen mid-scream. The crown was gone. But this is where the story turns from tragedy to mystery. Because 2 days after Bexley's burial, a guard at Windsor reported that he had seen a boy wearing a small crown wandering through the cloisters at dawn. When he followed, the figure vanished, leaving behind a trail of wet footprints leading straight into the sealed chapel wall. Queen Victoria was furious. She summoned Canon Henry Fane, the castle chaplain, to perform what she called a quiet cleansing. Fane, himself a student of medieval theology, was cautious. He spent 3 nights praying in the chapel, leaving the doors open to let the restless spirits pass. On the 3rd night, Fane wrote a letter to the Archbishop of Canterbury, a letter that would not be found until his death in 1882. It read, "The evil at Windsor is not of this earth. The curse was not born from poison, but from oath, an oath broken in blood and sealed by the cries of the innocent. The boy king's death chained others to him. They wait for a reckoning yet to come. What oath could he have meant? To understand that, we must look back to 1483 once more. Not to the feast, but to the morning after. Records from that week, smuggled out by a surviving page named Edric Holt, describe the aftermath in chilling detail. He wrote that as the bodies were cleared from the hall, a figure cloaked in black entered through the servants' door. The guards, thinking her a mourner, let her pass, but no one ever saw her leave. Edric's words, preserved in an obscure monastic chronicle in Bruges, tell us this. She went to the boy and laid her hand upon his heart and spoke words that made the torches flicker. When she was done, she turned to the dead and said, "None shall find peace until the crown returns to the pure of line. You will dine in shadow till your heir reclaims your place." Then she was gone, as though swallowed by the air. Was she a witch, a grieving mother, or a priestess of the old faith whose power predated Christianity? Whatever she was, her curse became binding. The spirits of the feast could not rest because the rightful heir never took the throne. The bloodline of Edward IV was cut short, and every monarch thereafter would carry, unknowingly, the shadow of that broken oath. Historians once dismissed this as superstition, yet strange patterns followed Windsor's royal residence. Edward VI died young. Charles V was executed. George III lost his mind within the castle walls. And Queen Victoria's own husband, Prince Albert, died suddenly after returning from Windsor in 1861, complaining of a chill that reached my very bones. Coincidence? Perhaps. But when examined alongside Father Alaric's forbidden journal and Canon Fane's letters, the line begins to blur between legend and truth. Because every time a monarch died under mysterious or premature circumstances, the Great Hall was under renovation. Every time. And the question that still haunts Windsor historians is this: what exactly lies beneath that sealed chamber, deep under St. George's Chapel? And why did the royal family quietly ban any further excavation after 1882? Perhaps because they already know what's waiting down there. In 1921, during the reign of King George V, the Royal Archives commissioned a secret inventory of artifacts found beneath Windsor Castle, an effort quietly labeled the Antiquarian Survey. Officially, it was meant to document Tudor foundations. Unofficially, it was a discreet attempt to rediscover the sealed chamber that had terrified Queen Victoria half a century earlier. The man chosen to lead it was Dr. Alistair Pennington, a brilliant historian from Cambridge known for his calm demeanor and obsessive curiosity about the occult history of the English crown. Pennington's diary, discovered after his mysterious death in 1932, remains one of the most chilling records ever associated with Windsor. It begins innocently enough. March 12, 1921. The foundations beneath the south transept bear evidence of reworked medieval stone. The masons of Edward IV appear to have reused older material, perhaps Roman or pre-Roman in origin. Odd markings, not runes, not Latin. I suspect Celtic ritual etchings. But only weeks later, the tone changes. April 5th. The workers complain of voices. The foreman says they hear a boy laughing when no one is near the trench. The air grows cold around sunset. One man refuses to return after seeing what he called shadows moving against the torchlight. Foolishness, perhaps, yet I, too, heard something tonight. A whisper. My name. The diary continues for months, entries that blend archaeology with growing dread. Then on June 14th, a breakthrough. We have found it. The hall beneath the hall. The seal bears the mark of Richard III, yet the architecture predates him by centuries. The table remains, the chairs intact, but the air tastes of iron. The torches die without wind. There are impressions on the dust, as though someone only recently rose from their seat. Pennington wrote that his team found a small oak coffer hidden beneath the table. Inside were three objects: a rusted goblet, a signet ring, and a folded parchment. The parchment, though fragile, bore a royal crest and a single line written in a hand, trembling yet deliberate. "Forgive me, brother, for I have dined with death." It was signed R. Historians would later argue endlessly about whether that initial stood for Richard III. If so, it would mean that Richard himself, the infamous protector of Edward V and his brother, had been present, or at least complicit, in that fatal feast. Pennington's final diary entry is written 2 days later, and it reads like a man breaking beneath something he cannot explain. June 16th. They sang last night. The dead. I heard the sound of cutlery, the scrape of plates. When I entered the chamber, every chair was filled with shapes made of mist and moonlight, and at the head of the table sat a boy wearing a crown of silver. He looked at me. He said, "You have found us. Now you must feast." I ran. God forgive me, I ran. The next morning, Pennington's assistant found him unconscious at his desk. His hair turned completely white. He was taken to an asylum in Berkshire, where he died 11 years later, never speaking of Windsor again. The chamber was sealed once more. All records of the survey were classified under royal warrant. But the silence didn't last. In 1940, during the Blitz, parts of Windsor's lower halls were damaged by German bombs. The explosion reopened sections of the underground tunnels that had lain untouched for centuries. Military engineers sent to assess the damage reported strange readings, compasses spinning wildly, sudden temperature drops. One lieutenant described hearing metallic clinking in the darkness, like wine goblets being raised in a toast. The engineers filled the space with concrete, sealing it forever, or so they thought. Because in 1953, during Queen Elizabeth II's coronation year, Windsor's archivist, Sir Malcolm Haversham, found an unsigned letter tucked inside an old Restoration-era ledger. It was dated 1685, addressed to the Keeper of Windsor, and contained a chilling instruction. "If ever the hall be disturbed again, the feast shall resume, and the crown shall bleed anew." To this day, no one knows who wrote it, but something did indeed stir that year. During a private dinner held in Windsor Castle to celebrate Elizabeth's coronation, guests reported the lights flickering, the air turning inexplicably cold. One server fainted after claiming she saw a boy in antique dress standing beside the Queen's chair, his eyes filled with tears. The royal family dismissed it as overwork and imagination. But among the palace staff, the whispers began anew. The old curse of Windsor, they said, was not history. It was patient. It waited. And it would not rest until the debt of that night in 1483 was finally paid. By the 1960s, the story of Windsor's deadly feast had become a myth whispered only among archivists and caretakers, dismissed by scholars as superstition. But in the winter of 1967, an event occurred that forced even the most rational historians to look twice. That year, Dr. Eleanor Gray, a young historian from Oxford specializing in Tudor religious practices, received permission to study Windsor's sealed records. Her request had been approved only because she was researching the architectural evolution of royal chapels, a subject the Crown considered safely academic. What no one realized was that Dr. Gray had her own motives. Her ancestor, Father Alaric Gray, had been the same confessor who recorded the first account of the feast's aftermath in 1483. Eleanor believed that her family carried a fragment of the truth the monarchy had buried. She began her work quietly, combing through dusty manuscripts and long-forgotten inventories. But in one leather-bound ledger, dated 1484, she found something that changed everything. It was a list of household expenses written in a steady clerk's hand. But under the heading, Provisions for the Feast of Renewal, one entry stood out: 12 chairs set, one left empty, one cup anointed, one song to be sung when the candles fail. No historian had ever seen this phrase before. The Feast of Renewal. It wasn't listed in any other royal record. Eleanor grew obsessed. She began descending into the castle's restricted lower corridors, parts of Windsor where few dared to go. The air there was colder, the walls older. Some sections still bore soot from the 1940 bombings. In one narrow hallway, behind a bricked-up alcove, she found what she later described in her private notes as a breath of ancient air. On December 18, 1967, she convinced 2 custodians to help her remove the bricks. Behind them lay a small circular room carved from rough stone. The floor was blackened, as if from centuries-old fire. At its center stood an iron stand, the shape of a chalice carved into its base. Eleanor's notes from that night are sparse, fragmented, almost desperate. Symbols on the wall, serpents, circles, a crown above a flame. Heard a sound like chanting, the smell of wine and earth, a whisper. One must drink again. The next morning, she was found unconscious near the chapel stairs. Her fingertips stained a dark reddish brown that no cleaning agent could remove. When she awoke 3 days later, she spoke only once about what she had seen. They are still waiting to be served. After that, she refused to return to Windsor. Her health declined rapidly over the following months. She was found dead in her Oxford flat the next year. Her heart stopped, her expression frozen in what one investigator described as a mix of awe and horror. Her personal effects were quietly confiscated by the Crown, her notebooks sealed in the royal archives, but a single page escaped. Her student, Michael Trent, who had helped her transcribe Latin passages, secretly photographed one of her notes before officials arrived. That photograph surfaced decades later. A faint, handwritten translation of what she had found carved beneath the chalice stand. When the feast is served in full, the kingdom will end in silence. Till then, the hungry shall remain at table. That phrase, the hungry shall remain at table, appeared nowhere else in English folklore. Yet it mirrored the strange reports that continued to plague Windsor's night staff through the 1970s and 1980s. Guards spoke of hearing the clatter of cutlery in empty rooms. Housemaids reported glimpsing pale silhouettes gathered as though in conversation, fading when approached. Some said the air near the Great Hall would turn sharply cold around midnight, even in summer. One night in 1978, a visiting photographer named Peter Latham captured an image that would become infamous. During a royal reception, his flashbulb malfunctioned, overexposing the photograph. But when developed, the image revealed faint outlines behind the guests. Ghostly figures seated at a long table, their faces blurred, yet distinctly present. Latham was told by royal officials that his film had been spoiled by double exposure. He was ordered to surrender the negatives, Instead, he kept one. That photo later surfaced anonymously in a London newspaper under the headline, "The Phantom Banquet of Windsor." The palace dismissed it as a hoax, but the photo's authenticity was never conclusively disproven. Meanwhile, deep within the royal archives, an internal memorandum was circulated in 1983, the 500th anniversary of the original feast. It instructed that no events, celebrations, or ceremonies be held in the Great Hall after dark that year. The memo was unsigned, its author listed only as HM Advisor on Historical Matters. Yet staff who worked that night told another story. At precisely midnight, the guards stationed near the hall reported hearing faint music. Not from the modern orchestra preparing for the next day's ceremony, but something older. Lute strings, a choir of voices singing in Latin. One guard, trembling, later told a reporter off record, it wasn't a song for the living. No one entered the hall again that night. The next morning, the heavy oak doors were found ajar, even though they'd been locked and sealed. Inside, the long banquet table, set for a rehearsal dinner, was disturbed. Every plate had been turned upside down, and on the high seat at the head of the table lay a single silver crown, identical, down to the smallest dent, to the one last seen in 1871. By the time the 1990s arrived, Windsor Castle had seen its share of modern ghosts, tabloid scandals, fires, and televised ceremonies. But few knew that beneath its shining restoration lay a secret that refused to die. The 1992 fire that tore through Windsor's upper floors, the one history remembers for its dramatic images of smoke billowing over the castle, was officially blamed on a faulty spotlight. But among the restorers and staff, whispers claimed the blaze began below, not above. A maintenance worker, Robert Fielding, told colleagues that just hours before the fire, he'd been dispatched to inspect a flickering electrical line beneath the Great Hall. The air in the subcellar, he said, smelled like burnt wine and candle wax. When he reached the lowest level, he found something that made his blood run cold. Ashes arranged in a perfect circle, surrounding what looked like an old dining chair leg, charred but intact. When he returned minutes later with another worker, the ashes were gone. The official report never mentioned Fielding's claim. But that same night, as flames ripped through the castle's upper floors, witnesses described hearing a sound just before the first roof beam collapsed, a deep, rolling choral hum, like voices singing through smoke. No recording captured it, but one firefighter later said, "It was like 100 men chanting in Latin, but not a word I could understand." When reconstruction began the following year, the Crown ordered all lower corridors sealed for safety reasons. Yet during the restoration, a small team of conservators stumbled upon another relic. Behind a section of newly exposed stone near the Hall of St. George was a fragment of painted plaster, still bearing color despite the centuries. On it, barely legible, was a faint image, 12 figures seated around a table, one smaller figure standing apart, holding what appeared to be a goblet. In red pigment above their heads were words no one expected to find in a royal chapel. Venite et cenam mortuorum. Come to the feast of the dead. The fragment was quietly removed, archived, and never shown to the public. But by 1996, the legend had leaked again. This time through Lady Caroline Montrose, a distant cousin of the Queen, and a respected historian of medieval religion. She had been granted brief access to Windsor's subterranean passages for her research. Months later, she gave a private talk at Cambridge, speaking cryptically of a hall that breathes beneath the chapel. A transcript of that talk survives. Her words, measured but chilling, read, "The castle's foundation lies upon more than stone. It lies upon an oath. The deadly feast was not merely murder. It was a covenant gone wrong. They sought to bind loyalty by ritual, to renew the crown with sacrifice. But the wrong blood was spilled, the wrong cup raised. That is why they remain. Those who dined in defiance of order, condemned to feast in shadow until the line is cleansed." 2 weeks later, Lady Montrose vanished while traveling to France. Her car was found abandoned near Dover, engine still running. She was never seen again. The royal household denied any connection, but those close to her said she had been carrying a small box wrapped in cloth. The same dimensions, they claimed, as the oak coffer Dr. Pennington had described in 1921. When her London townhouse was later cleared, nothing of the sort was found. Then in 2004, during an extensive digital scanning project of Windsor's architecture, an anomaly appeared. The imaging equipment picked up a void, a hollow cavity beneath the Great Hall, where no modern construction existed. When engineers tried to measure it with radar, the signal failed entirely, as if the space itself absorbed sound. One technician, speaking anonymously to a BBC researcher, said the readings suggested not one chamber, but 3, stacked like layers of forgotten memory. The lowest one, he said, emitted a faint resonance, like a low hum, almost musical. Royal officials dismissed it as interference, but something curious followed. In 2005, during the Queen's private birthday dinner held at Windsor, a power failure struck the castle for exactly 3 minutes and 20 seconds. In that brief darkness, multiple guests later swore they heard the clinking of glass echoing faintly from the floor below. When the lights returned, one of the table's silver goblets had spilled. The wine, so the butler later reported, had turned from ruby to black, as if ink had swallowed it. The goblet was removed, never seen again. Still, there were those who refused to let the truth vanish. Among them was Dr. James Calvert, a historian with the British Museum, who in 2012 began compiling an independent report titled The Windsor Enigma: Ritual, Death, and Power Beneath the Crown. His research pulled from suppressed documents, private correspondence, and even eyewitness accounts from former guards. He connected the dots others had ignored. Every major renovation, every fire, every royal illness at Windsor aligned with attempts, documented or rumored, to access the buried halls. Each time, something went wrong. His conclusion was stark. The deadly feast was never a myth. It was an event of deliberate invocation, a rite intended to bind the monarchy to a perpetual covenant of dominion. But the act backfired. The oath consumed its masters. Since then, Windsor has remained both fortress and prison. Its ghosts, not guests, but keepers. When Dr. Calvert attempted to publish his findings, his university revoked permission, citing national sensitivity. He resigned, disappeared from academia, and in a 2014 radio interview simply said, "If you listen closely in the Great Hall at midnight, you will hear the kingdom feeding itself." That was the last time he spoke publicly. Today, the official tours of Windsor Castle avoid mentioning the lower foundations. Visitors walk the same marble floors once drenched in wine and blood, unaware that only meters below, 12 seats remain occupied, though no living man can see them. And late at night, when the Thames mist creeps over the battlements, the guards still whisper a single rule passed quietly from one generation to the next. Never look into the Hall of Shadows after midnight, because sometimes, just sometimes, someone looks back. During the spring of 2019, a team of historical conservators was quietly commissioned to re-examine Windsor's sub-basement ventilation system. The official reason was prosaic: humidity control for archival storage. But those involved knew it was really about the noise. For months, night guards had been reporting a faint metallic rhythm rising from the stone floors of the Great Hall between 2 and 3 hours a.m., the exact hour when 5 centuries earlier the original feast was said to have ended in screams. At first, engineers blamed old pipes or distant traffic. Then one guard, ex-Royal Navy, brought in a portable hydrophone recorder, hoping to capture proof for a wager. What he caught instead defied reason. When played back through studio equipment, the sound wasn't random. It was patterned. A low cadence of 12 beats followed by a pause, then the faint ring of crystal, like a toast. A digital analyst from the BBC, who examined the file later, confirmed that the sequence repeated precisely every 7 minutes and 12 seconds. The Crown's communications office seized the original recording within days. But the pattern remained. Beneath the castle, during those same weeks, the conservators found something that made the electricians abandon the site altogether. An iron door, 10 feet wide, sealed flush into the foundation wall. It was not on any blueprint, and its hinges bore a design unused since the 15th century. Serpent motifs coiling into a crown. A crest had been chiseled halfway off, as if someone long ago had tried to erase it. Enough remained to identify 3 letters: R-E-D. The discovery was never announced publicly, but correspondence leaked later through a retired surveyor described what followed. The team attempted to bore a pinhole camera through the mortar, only for the drill bit to shear off after a single turn, the metal fracturing like glass. Moments later, every light in the sub-basement failed simultaneously. They evacuated. The following night, the on-duty guard, Private Lewis Grant, filed a report stating he saw shadows moving under the crack of the new door, as though by candlelight. When he called for backup, the movement ceased, but the temperature near the door registered -8 degrees Celsius. Grant resigned 2 days later. In the weeks that followed, the castle's senior curator, Dame Harriet Longden, authorized an archival deep dive to learn what the door might have sealed. Her research led to a restricted volume in the Royal Library titled Inventarium Mortuorum, 1686. Inside was a passage written in Latin by the castle's then warden. The hall below is barred with iron and flame. Let none open, for within are those who dine forever. The door is their covenant, its rust, their blood. Longden, shaken, stopped her inquiry there. But before she returned the book, she copied one final sentence from the margin, added by an unknown hand centuries later in English. When the rust runs red, the crown will tremble. 2 months later, the United Kingdom entered a year of turmoil. Political crisis, fire at Notre Dame, unrest abroad. It was coincidence, of course. Yet among the older staff at Windsor, the old superstition stirred again. When the castle's curse awakened, the realm itself felt the echo. By autumn, rumors swirled that a discreet royal initiative, codenamed Project St. George, had been established to stabilize environmental conditions beneath the chapel and Great Hall. No blueprints were ever released, but satellite ground penetration scans showed new reinforced walls extending outward from the castle's base like ribs. an architectural exorcism in stone. Still, the noises persisted. Tour guides occasionally mentioned that the Great Hall was unavailable due to conservation work. Visitors noticed nothing unusual until October 31st, 2019, when a charity banquet was held there for the first time in decades. It was a lavish affair: crystal, silver, and 12 long tables arranged in a circle, meant to echo ancient Tudor design. The Queen attended briefly before retiring. Around midnight, as the guests prepared to toast, the chandeliers flickered and died. For exactly 1 minute, the hall lay in darkness. Several witnesses later claimed they saw figures standing behind the guests, tall, indistinct, their faces pale and shifting. When the lights returned, a single wine goblet at the high table had shattered. The next morning, staff found faint crimson stains seeping through the mortar near the base of the west wall. Iron oxide, according to the restoration team. Rust. But to those who knew the legend, the message was unmistakable. The rust had run red. Since that night, the Great Hall has been closed again, officially for structural inspection. Yet locals walking the long walk after dusk tell of hearing faint laughter drifting through the fog, and sometimes, when the wind is right, the clink of 12 glasses raised in unison. Windsor stands renewed, its turrets immaculate, its flags bright against the sky. But beneath the stone, the feast continues. The guests, bound by oath and hunger, wait for the kingdom's final silence, the moment when the last living heir takes their seat among the dead. And if you ever tour Windsor Castle, and the guide hurries you past a locked iron door in the lower corridors, remember this story. Remember the laughter beneath your feet. Because some histories don't rest. They dine, they drink, they wait. You've been listening to Horror in the Halls, The Deadly Feast, and The Ghostly Curse at Windsor Castle. Subscribe to History One for the next descent into Europe's hidden past, where the walls remember what kings forget.